Under the bright heat of Mauritania, the sand around the Eye of the Sahara feels sharp under the wind. And from above, that huge ring can look less like a hill than a broken piece of something built. That is where the trouble starts. Because if a natural shape can imitate a city this well, what exactly are we looking at? The Richat structure is almost 40 kilometers across, a set of concentric rings so large astronauts use it as a landmark. The official answer is calm and tidy, a deeply eroded dome, an anticline, layers of rock folded and worn down over time. No crater, no volcano, just geology. But the people who argue for a drowned city point to the same place and see a different story. They say the rings feel planned, the center feels placed, and the landscape around it once held water. During the African humid period, this part of the Sahara was green, with lakes and rivers threading through open land. So the question isn't just what the structure is, it's why this place keeps acting like a memory of something lost. If the desert was once alive here, what else could it have buried? If this kind of mystery pulls you in, like and subscribe for the next part. That official explanation matters because it keeps the story honest. The Richat structure is not being pushed as some miracle crater or lost machine. Geologists see folded layers, erosion, and a dome that got stripped open over time. Fair enough. But the strange part is how the place still behaves like a clue. Around it, the ground is cut by old river paths, dry now, but still readable if you know what to look for. One of them seems to run straight toward the rings, like water once chose that route on purpose. And that matters in a Sahara that was not always dry. In the African humid period, this whole region held lakes, grass, and moving water. So when proponents of a drowned city look at the site, they are not staring at an empty desert. They are staring at a landscape that used to breathe. Plato keeps coming back into the discussion, even carefully, even contested. A place beyond the Pillars of Hercules, then lost to water and time. Could a memory of that kind survive in a shape like this? Or are people reading a story into stone because the stone refuses to stay quiet? And this is where the argument changes shape. It stops being, does the place look unusual, and becomes, could an old text be describing the memory of a real landscape, badly preserved but not fully lost? Plato said Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules and vanished roughly 9,000 years before Solon. Proponents know that sounds extreme, but they focus on two things: direction and age. Direction points west of the Mediterranean world. Age points back toward the end of the last ice age, when climate was unstable and coastlines, rivers, and habitable zones were shifting hard. Now put that beside the site itself, the ground first. A ringed formation on a huge scale, water traces nearby. A region that, in that earlier window, was not dead sand, but open country with runoff, lakes, and movement. Suddenly, the claim is not that Plato drew a perfect map, it is that he may have preserved the outline of a disaster. Mainstream geology still says this is rock shaped by time. Fair, but if the stone is natural and the memory is human, could both sides be touching different halves of the same buried story? This is why the dry channels matter so much. They are not just cracks in the ground. They are old roots, cut deep enough to hold the shape of water long after the water is gone. Near the place, a few of those lines still seem to lean toward the rings, as if the land remembers where flow used to go. During the African humid period, that memory was not theoretical. Rain hit harder, lakes spread, rivers moved through ground that now looks stripped and hard. So when proponents talk about the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara, as a drowned city, they are not imagining a fantasy in a blank desert. They are reading a vanished, wet landscape. And this is where the official version starts to feel incomplete. Yes, the structure is an eroded dome. Yes, geology explains the folds. But geology does not answer why this exact shape sits inside this exact network of old watermarks. It does not explain why the site feels less like a random hill and more like a center point. So the question gets sharper. If water once fed this place, and the ground still points to it, what was here before the sand closed over everything? Once that possibility is on the table, the eye starts doing something dangerous. It begins to read the land as design. The outer ring looks like a boundary. The inner bands feel nested, almost zoned, and the raised center sits there in the heat haze like a core that everything else was built around. That does not prove a city. It proves a pattern the brain cannot ignore. The place is nearly 40 kilometers wide, far beyond the scale of any normal settlement, which is exactly why critics push back. They say this is the oldest trap in the book. Humans see intention in symmetry. A face in clouds, a fortress in stone, streets where there are only fractures. But the counterargument is just as sharp. Proponents are not saying the whole formation was carved by human hands. They are saying a natural structure may have been used, adapted, even turned into a center by people who understood terrain better than we give them credit for. And that changes the question again. Maybe the rings were never walls. Maybe they were the ready-made skeleton of a place built around water, shelter, and visibility. If so, what would a lost settlement choose first? The stone or the flow running toward it? That choice, stone or water, may be the key to why this place keeps dragging people back. In a harsh landscape, elevation matters. A ringed rise gives sightlines, drainage, and a natural frame. If water moved in from nearby channels, then the formation would not just be visible, it would be useful. This is where the argument gets more technical. Supporters of the drowned city reading point out that settlements do not always begin on flat ground. They begin where the land already solves problems. A raised center stays drier. Curving bands can guide movement. Open gaps can become access points. None of that means the rings were built by people, only that people could have organized their lives around them. And once that idea settles in, the scale stops killing the theory and starts reshaping it. Maybe this was not a single compact city in the modern sense. Maybe it was a regional hub, a layered site, part refuge and part meeting ground, spread across terrain that already looks structured from above. Which leads to the next problem. If this place was used that way, what kind of loss would erase the settlement but leave the giant pattern sitting there in plain sight? That kind of loss does not have to look like a wave crashing over walls. In a place like this, drowning can happen in reverse. Water leaves. Grass dies, mudflats harden, wind starts sanding the ground day after day until paths blur, edges soften, and anything built from lighter material is chewed down to almost nothing. So when supporters call it a drowned city, they do not always mean the sea stood over these rings. Some mean a settlement could have been drowned by collapse itself, by the death of the wet world that made the site worth living in. The structure stays because stone stays. The human layer goes because human work is fragile. That idea fits the place in an uncomfortable way. A natural form can survive 10,000 years of exposure. Reed, timber, packed earth, storage pits, animal pens, even roads worn into softer ground. Those vanish much faster once the climate turns against them. What remains is the giant frame, and a silence that looks geological, because geology outlives everything else. And if the water world around it died slowly, instead of all at once, then the next question becomes even harder. Would the memory of that place survive more accurately in ruins or in story? That may be the most important turn in the whole argument. Ruins rot, collapse, or get buried. Stories travel. They shrink, they exaggerate, they change names, but they can carry the outline of a place long after the place itself stops making sense to the people living nearby. So the Atlantis comparison, for supporters, is about asking whether a memory of a remarkable site could survive the damage of retelling, not about treating Plato like a surveyor with a ruler. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Destroyed in a remote age, connected to water, lost from ordinary geography. Those are not exact coordinates, but they are not nothing either. Now put that beside this formation, a vast target in the middle of a region that used to be alive. Concentric rings visible at a scale no traveler would forget. A landscape later transformed so hard that the surviving shape would seem impossible to explain in human terms. That is how legend starts, not from perfect detail, but from a real place broken by time. And once a location becomes too old, too dry, too altered to read clearly, who decides what counts as memory and what gets dismissed as myth? This is why the question of memory matters so much here. The place is not just a shape in the sand. It is a test of what survives when water, roads, and people are gone. If the settlement layer was light, the climate could erase it fast, and the rings would stay behind, like a hard outline on an old map. And that's the part proponents keep leaning on. The African humid period gave this region a wet pulse. Then the pulse broke. Lakes shrank. Wind took over. A site that once sat inside living ground could be left standing in a dead one, with only dry channels and dusty hollows pointing back to where flow used to be. So the argument stops being, did the city sink under the sea, and becomes, did the land swallow it first? That's a very different kind of drowning, and it fits a place that still looks like a center after everything around it has been stripped away. The official version still holds the dome. The anomaly is the memory trail around it. Because if those traces really lead inward, then what was once there may not be as lost as it looks. That is also why the lack of clean ruins does not settle the argument. In a dry wind, soft walls do not stand a chance. Mud brick turns to dust, timber breaks down, and shallow streets get smoothed over until the ground looks untouched. The Richat structure can keep its bold shape while the human layer fades almost completely. So the official version keeps pointing to the dome, the folded rock, the long erosion. Fair enough. But the anomaly stays in the same place, a giant form sitting in a region where water once moved, where old channels still cut the land, where a lost settlement could have been worn away instead of preserved. That is what makes the theory stubborn. The place does not need to be a perfect ruin to be meaningful. It only needs to be a site that once gathered people, then lost the conditions that held them there. After that, the desert does the rest. It sands down memory as carefully as it sands down walls. And if the desert can erase almost everything except the outline, then what exactly would we expect to find next? The city? Or only the shape of its absence? That is why the story never really ends at the ground. Once the ruins are thin enough, the only thing left is the echo. A dry wind can clear a surface, but it cannot erase every human pattern in one pass. It leaves scraps behind, a path here, a hollow there, a shape that feels too deliberate to ignore. And that is where the old texts keep sneaking back in, as memory. A place beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a world tied to water, a loss so complete that later readers had to argue over whether it was history or warning. The Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara, as a drowned city, sits right in that gap. So the question is no longer whether the desert can hide a settlement. It clearly can. The harder question is how long a place can survive as a story after the walls, streets, and people are gone. If the landscape keeps only the outline, what part of the truth are we actually seeing? The city, or the last thing it left behind? That is why the place keeps sitting at the edge of geology and legend. A dome explains the rock. A dry memory explains the pull. And both can exist in the same frame without canceling each other out. What makes the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara, as a drowned city so stubborn is the timing. The Sahara was not always a wall of sand. During the African humid period, this region held water long enough for channels, pools, and movement to shape the land. Then the climate shifted, and the same ground began to lose everything that made it habitable. So the argument changes again. Was this a city under the sea? Becomes, was it a place stranded by climate, then smoothed over until only the shell remained? That is a much quieter kind of disappearance, and maybe a more likely one. The official version still says erosion. The anomaly is how neatly the old water lines point back at the rings. If that pattern is real, then the question is no longer where the city went. It is how much of its footprint is still hidden under the sand. And what else the dry ground is refusing to show. That is where the separate threads begin to lock together, imperfectly. And that matters, but tightly enough that the place stops feeling like one odd formation and starts feeling like a crossroads of clues. Take the terrain first. The rings are real. The raised center is real. The old water paths around it are real. Then add the climate window, a Sahara that, for thousands of years, could support movement, grazing, camps, and settlement. Then add the textual echo, Plato placing a lost power beyond the Pillars of Hercules, deep in the past, tied to destruction and disappearance. None of those pieces proves the others, but together they stop sitting quietly. This is exactly why the argument refuses to die. Mainstream geology explains how the stone formed. It does not really address why this particular natural form fits so neatly into a zone of vanished water and remembered loss. Supporters of the drowned city reading lean on that overlap hard, because overlap is where alternative history lives. And once three different kinds of evidence begin pointing at the same place, the burden changes. Is this all coincidence, or the edge of a pattern we have been trained not to follow? At this point, the pieces stop acting like separate claims and start pressing on each other. The dome explains the stone. The old water lines explain the setting. The lost climate explains why a place could be occupied, then abandoned, then half erased by sand. And the old text still sits there in the background, stubborn about a place beyond the Pillars of Hercules. That is the core of the drowned city reading. Proponents are not asking anyone to throw out geology. They are asking why the geology lands in a region with a clear, wet past, a giant circular form, and traces of flow that seem to aim straight at it. A natural feature can be real and still be used as a landmark by memory, story, or settlement. So the question gets sharper, not softer. If a civilization once stood here, or even used this place as a center, the dry ground would not need to keep walls to keep the story alive. It would only need to keep the outline. And that is the part the desert does so well. It hides almost everything, then leaves one impossible shape in plain sight. If the outline is all that survived, what else might be buried just beyond it? At this stage, the best argument is no longer one clue, but the way the clues refuse to separate. The dome stays in the rock. The water history stays in the land. The old text stays in the memory of a lost place beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And the title people keep arguing over sits right on top of all three. That is why the official version never quite shuts the door. It can explain erosion, layers, and shape. It can even explain why a huge ring would survive when softer material disappeared. But it still has to pass by the same dry channels, the same vanished wet world, the same sense that this place was once more than a hill in the sand. So the drowned city reading remains contested, but not empty. It survives because it keeps matching the landscape in awkward little ways. A center, an outline, a memory of water, but enough to keep the question alive. And if the question survives this long, then maybe the desert has not finished speaking. What else is still buried just under the last bright skin of sand? That is where the modern warning starts to bite. If a place can be stripped so cleanly that only its outline survives, then the danger is not just ancient. It is about how fast a world can lose the things that make it readable at all. The Richat structure sits there as a reminder that climate can do the work of erasure without fire, without conquest, without noise. During the African humid period, this land carried water and life. Later, the water pulled back, the ground dried out, and the old settlement signature, if there was one, would have been left exposed to wind, dust, and time. The desert does not need to destroy a city in a day. It can just keep going. And so this case keeps unsettling people. The standard account explains the rock. The anomaly is the pattern of loss around it, and the way the pattern still points inward. If the climate changed once this hard, what would stop the same kind of disappearance from happening again, only this time around us? At this point, the argument is less about one fact and more about the pressure between all of them. The stone still says dome. The land still says water. The old memory still says a place lost beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And none of those voices has gone quiet. So, the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara, as a drowned city, refuses to stay buried as a simple theory. Proponents keep pointing out the same thing. The rings are too bold, the dry channels too suggestive, the climate story too neat to ignore. The standard view can explain each part on its own, but not why they keep lining up in the same frame. So the mystery becomes bigger, not smaller. If this was only a natural fold, why does it sit in a landscape that once ran wet? If it was once used by people, why did the desert keep the outline and take everything else? That is the kind of loss that looks clean only from far away. And when a place becomes that old, that dry, that hard to read, even the silence starts to feel like evidence. Unless something under the sand is still waiting to answer back. And that is where the mystery finally stops being about proving Atlantis like a courtroom case. The Richat structure may remain, in the strictest sense, a natural dome. The drowned city reading may remain contested. But the pressure of the evidence does something harder to dismiss than a single claim. It shows how a livable world can vanish while its frame stays behind. That is the image that lingers. Just a vast ring in the heat. A place once touched by water, then abandoned to wind. Stone keeps the skeleton. Everything lighter goes first. Paths fade. Banks flatten. A settlement, if it stood there, would not need to explode to disappear. It would only need the climate to stop agreeing with it. Maybe this place feels older than the argument around it. The sand slides over the same curves year after year, and the outline still refuses to go away. A lost city, a misread landscape, a memory trapped in rock. All three possibilities point to the same uncomfortable fact. When the sun drops low over Mauritania, the rings throw long shadows into the dust, and the center darkens before the edges do. For a few minutes, it looks less like a ruin than a warning that stayed in place after the people did not.